Thank you for welcoming me. I'm going to be diplomatic here. I grew up a Dodger fan. My hero was Sandy Koufax. But I was also a big fan of Willie Mays, the San Francisco Giants. And frankly, I feel in subbing for Dan tonight that I'm pinch hitting for Willie Mays, because Dan Krieger is the Willie Mays of local historians. But what I want to explore is our pretty wild west. And we'll start with a place about 17 miles from where we are today. The gold rush was also a boon for the local economy. We were a cow county, and cattle, which had traditionally been raised for their tallow and their hides, were now valued for their meat. There were thousands of hungry miners to feed. And that would lead to the first mass murder in California history at Mission San Miguel, uh, which we'll talk about in just a second. I love this picture. This is just a wonderful demonstration of how eager men were to get to the gold fields. These are abandoned ships in Yerba Buena Bay. That led to this watering hole in San Francisco's financial district, the Old Ship Saloon with an appropriate street sign out front. And about 8 years ago, by golly, in a lot right next door, they found the old ship. It was called the Arkansas. It did not carry gold miners, it carried Methodists who were headed for the gold fields to proselytize. Lord knows the gold fields needed that. Sadly, the Arkansas ran aground on Alcatraz, was towed across the bay, was beached. No longer belonging to Methodists, it became a saloon, and then a brothel, and then a saloon. It was three deserters from a Navy ship in San Francisco Bay, along with two killers, refugees from the goldfields who met up at Mission Soledad in 1848, headed south down El Camino Real to Mission San Miguel, where they murdered 10 people, the Reed family and their servants. Reed had made the mistake of bragging to the visitors about a sale of sheep he'd made to the gold fields. He said he had a gold pouch that was so heavy that his 4-year-old son couldn't lift it. That was the end of the Reed family. The next people to find the victims were two South Cali rancheros. John Price, in the rocking chair with a shotgun, was the founder of Pismo Beach. His friend, Francis Branch, upper left, Rancho Santa Manuela, was the founder of Arroyo Grande. They arrived the next night to find the murder victims. Price said he did not sleep for 3 nights. He sent a note south to William Dana because the killers were rumored to be headed in his direction toward Napomo. That note survives in the Mission Santa Barbara archives today, and I was delighted to find out that it's written in a language I would call Spanglish. Look out for the güero, the blondie, the note said, who is one of the leaders of the gang. It was a Santa Barbara posse that caught up with them on the beach at Summerlin. There was a gunfight. One posse member was killed. 2 gang members were killed. One of them, evidently, while trying to swim to Hawaii, didn't make it. The remaining 3 were brought back to Santa Barbara, put on trial, and executed by an Army firing squad about here. So next time you're on Chapala Street, somewhere around the Bank of America and a California pizza kitchen, this is where the 3 men were shot. The man who commanded the firing squad was a young artillery lieutenant, Edward O.C. Ord, who, like Sherman, would become a Civil War general. And of course, Fort Ord was named for him. Of course, the most famous outlaw of the time was named Joaquin Murrieta, whose legend was popularized in a novel written by a fellow named John Rollin Ridge. He was alleged to be kind of a Robin Hood, but there may have been many Joaquins. At one point, 3 robberies on the same day were reported in San Jose, San Juan Bautista, and Los Angeles, all of them allegedly carried out by Joaquin. So he was credited with robberies, whether it was actually Joaquin Murrieta himself, up and down the state. He did not rob from the rich and give to the poor. He robbed from everybody and gave to Joaquin. There's evidence that he and the gang camped out one night in the Mission San Luis Obispo Gardens in 1852. Folklorist has it that Joaquin's mother lived on Churro Street in San Luis Obispo, but that's less reliable. His end came again at the hands of these scary guys, the California Rangers. He was ambushed, and he and some gang members were shot dead by the so-called California Rangers. Now, the state legislature had offered a $5,000 reward, a substantial amount of money now, even more so in 1853. But Harry Love had to prove that they had killed Joaquin, so what better way to do it than to bring in his head preserved in a jar of alcohol? And that's what he did, and that's how he got his reward. Joaquin's head suffered the indignity of becoming a sensation, exhibited in towns throughout the gold country, until, mercifully for Joaquin, it disappeared in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So Highway 101, once called El Camino Real, was a dangerous stretch of road. Our first superintendent of schools, David Newsom, rode from San Luis Obispo to Santa Barbara on a campaign swing with a friend of his who was running for state assembly. And every 20 miles or so, his friend would point out where the skeletal remains of robbers' victims had been found, about as often as Anderson's pea soup billboards are seen along the highway today. So in the 1850s, that was one of the deadliest stretches of road in America. And it was along El Camino Real, above the Cuesta Grade, where a suspected killer of two peddlers was apprehended and brought back to the San Luis Obispo jail, which was then at the end of the Mission Colonnade. The man made a break for it. To his credit, he hot-footed it toward San Luis Mountain, with the citizens of San Luis Obispo firing their pistols in pursuit. He did not make it. He was brought back to the jail and died a horrific death. He was lynched from the joist of the jailhouse door that night. The story made the front page of this newspaper. This is the New York Times. Now, his escape route would have taken him across the campus of what is today's Mission Prep. It was the Immaculate Heart Academy in 1874. Of course, that was open country in 1853. Several years ago, they did an archaeological dig, and among the other things they found were several spent rifle cartridges, most from the early 20th century, which makes me wonder about the Immaculate Heart sisters who ran the place. Were they nuns with guns? I don't know. But it's the bullet on the left that interests me the most, because it would have fit an 1849 Colt revolver. I wonder if maybe that wasn't one of the shots fired at the fleeing suspect that day in 1853. Oh, to have purchased real estate then. Jack Powers, if I were to cast him in a movie, I'd choose a handsome actor with a similar name from the 30s and 40s, Tyrone Power. And Jack Powers' Santa Barbara was a wild place, as was San Luis Obispo. And Powers was extremely popular during his time in Santa Barbara. He was a graceful dancer, very charismatic, and I guess handsome. That would be my guess, because the women of Santa Barbara loved him. He loved horses, was a superb rider, and as the Irish do, he loved to bet on horses. So the men of Santa Barbara loved him, and when Powers won a bet, the drinks were on Jack Powers. San Luis Obispo, his chief lieutenant, was another vaquero, another superb horseman, a horse breaker. We think this is Pio Linares. He lived in this substantial home above today's San Luis Obispo High School. His father had sold much of his land in the Los Osos Valley to Captain John Wilson. Now, that home is one of many that is still here. It is said that Pio Linares is still there too. I have a thing about ghosts, so I have no intention of personally investigating. The gang not only robbed, they left no witnesses. San Luis Obispo County was, I think, outside of Bleeding, Kansas, where there was a preview of the Civil War, maybe the most dangerous place in America in 1858. Here's a statistical proof of that. If you extrapolated the homicide rate for San Luis Obispo County to a city the size of St. Louis, this is the result you would get. So, justifiably, San Luis Obispo County citizens were terrified. Well, Linares was another outlaw that needed attending to, and Sheriff Francisco Castro, to his frustration, lost him after a gun battle in the hills outside San Luis Obispo. At this point, the good citizens of the county decided that the Powers Linares gang was simply too much for one man to handle. And that one man was, to coin a phrase, a tough dude. He stuck it out. I read about him apprehending a murder suspect in a card parlor on Choro by literally dragging the man out and off to jail by his collar. He was fearless. He also conducted the only legal hanging in county history. All the other hangings were extra legal, and after 1859, executions were carried out at the prison at San Quentin. Even the way he ended his life demonstrates his toughness. He and a neighbor near Avila Beach, where he lived, got into some kind of argument. The neighbor pulled his revolver and shot Castro at point-blank range. Castro pulled his revolver, and it misfired. Badly wounded, he used it to beat the man to death, and then he died the next day. Castro's house, greatly enlarged, and I think with a dish antenna he did not have, it still stands near Avila Beach today. So they patterned their committee on the more famous one in San Francisco. Ours has the dubious distinction of hanging more men than theirs did. Here's part of the membership roll with Murray's name at the top. This is another name is circled, John Matlock. I'll talk about him in just a second. The Vigilance Committee formed a posse. It was said that Linares was hiding out on what has once been his father's rancho in the Los Osos Valley. The rumor turned out to be true. There was a 2-day gun battle near Turry Road. Linares was killed, shot through the head. John Matlock, the young Vigilance Committee member whose name was circled, was also killed. Two gang members, suspected gang members, were brought back to San Luis Obispo for trial that took place in what is today the common room of Mission San Luis Obispo. And the day after John Matlock's public funeral, they were hanged. We think that 6 men in total were hanged by the Vigilance Committee, and there's a reason to believe that at least one of them was innocent. Jack Powers was not. I can find no record of Jack Powers personally killing anyone. He led a gang of killers. I can find no record of Charles Manson killing anybody either, but he's a murderer too. Powers himself would be a murder victim in a dispute over a woman in Nogales. Another outlaw would shoot him dead. Almost 30 years later, there was another outbreak of kind of an ad hoc vigilante committee, but this time in my hometown of Arroyo Grande. Father and son were hanged from that railroad trestle over Arroyo Grande Creek. The son, PJ, was only 15 and a half. They had been accused of killing a young couple, neighbors, in Lopez Canyon after a long-standing property dispute. PJ was the killer. He came onto the neighbor's property, the Walkers, with a rifle, shot Mr. Walker dead in his vegetable garden, shot the family dog. When Mrs. Walker came screaming out of the house, he shot her twice. A lynch mob broke into what passed for the Rio Grande City Jail that night, and the father and son were thrown off the railroad bridge. Here's the trestle or bridge. The next morning, April Fool's Day, sadly, the first people to encounter the still hanging bodies were school children on their way to school. Let's get more cheerful. This is the Santa Barbara San Luis Obispo stage ascending the San Marcos Pass in 1880. An earlier stage had contained Mrs. Dana of Rancho Napomo. They had to ask her to get out so the stage could get over the grade. Mr. Dana took exception with that and wrote a nasty letter to the stagecoach company. But this 1880 stage was robbed twice the following year in our county. And the perp was this man. Dick Fellows had studied for the bar in his native Kentucky, gave it up, came west to California to become a hog farmer. When tragically his hogs were killed in a terrific fire, he turned to the next logical occupation, and that was robbing stagecoaches. His first job was in the Cahuenga Pass near San Fernando. He stepped into the path of the oncoming stagecoach, stopped it. But a passenger leaped out of the stagecoach and began firing his revolver at Dick Fellows, who returned fire. Now, amid the gunshots, the stagecoach driver alertly took the chance to whip the team into a gallop and escaped safely. Unfortunately, immediately following the stagecoach was Dick Fellows' horse. So there were the two men facing each other, and I guess Fellows robbed the other guy and made him walk back to San Fernando. Fellows never saw the horse again. Now another job was east of Bakersfield. There was a Wells Fargo stage rumored to be carrying a lot of cash in its strongbox. So Fellows rented a horse, selected an ambush spot, and at the moment he heard the stagecoach approaching, his horse bucked, threw him to the ground, and knocked him unconscious as the stage passed unharmed through the ambush spot. Fellows later found out there had been $50,000 in that strongbox. I admire his persistence. He said, by golly, I didn't get it the first time, I'll get it on the return trip. And he did it this time. He stopped the stagecoach. The driver threw down the strongbox. Fellows was hoisting the strongbox up to the pommel of his horse's saddle when the horse bolted, took off. The straw box fell on Dick Fellow's foot, hurting him badly. So he was dragging it, cursing and sweating, in the dark, and fell over a cliff and broke his leg. Fortunately, at the bottom of the cliff was a miner's camp with an available horse, which Dick Fellows promptly stole, and he made his escape. That particular horse had just been shod with 3 horseshoes and 1 mule shoe, so the trail that Fellows left was ridiculously easy for the Kern County Sheriff to follow. He went to San Quentin, where he was the chaplain's assistant. He taught moral philosophy and Spanish, thank you very much. And when he was paroled, he resumed robbing stagecoaches, but this time in our part of the state. So he robbed several stagecoaches between Santa Barbara and King City, and striking twice near my hometown. But it was a robbery near Los Alamos that did him in. He was unwise enough to steal the stage driver's watch, which was engraved with the stage driver's name, which was found in Dick Fellow's pocket. Made it ridiculously easy for a Santa Barbara jury to convict him, sentence him to the new prison at Folsom. So he was awaiting transport in the Santa Barbara County Jail when the deputy brought him breakfast one morning, opened the cell door. Fellows knocked the deputy down, ran out the front door, jumped on the nearest horse, and went hell-bent for leather down Santa Barbara Street. He made a sharp left turn. His horse ran into another horse, bucked him off. He was lying stunned in the middle of the street and quickly surrounded by irate citizens who took him back to jail, where he asked the deputy if he couldn't have his breakfast now. We had a few celebrities in our county. This is not one of them. This is my great-great-grandfather. My wife and I visited Lexington, Missouri, where he had fought a Civil War battle. You see, there's a souvenir in the county courthouse. But far more important, who 2 years later things were getting hot in Missouri. There was a new and aggressive radical Republican governor. Frank and Jesse, being former Confederate guerrillas and bank robbers, were most desperately wanted and probably would have been hanged had they been caught. So they decided it wiser to come to California, stay on their Uncle Drury's ranch, where they allegedly lived in this cabin for about a year. They also came to find their father's grave. Mr. James had, believe it or not, been a Baptist preacher, and like the Methodists in the Arkansas, he had come to the goldfields to do some converting. He got ill and died. Jesse and Frank never did find the grave, but they did play at being cowboy. Jesse was a superb horseman, but he was no cowboy. Nobody laughed at him because occasionally he would pull out his Colt Navy revolver and pick off a rattlesnake or a jackrabbit. 2 years later, in 1870, they would resume their outlaw career in Missouri. And one of their first jobs, Jesse thought the bank teller was a man who had been an informant whose testimony had led to one of his comrades' deaths during the Civil War. Jesse shot the man dead in the bank. He'd shot an innocent man. It was a case of mistaken identity. And the two, their outlaw career would be typified by mistakes like that. James Brothers often rode with their cousins, the Youngers. Bill Dalton's mother was a Younger, and he was a respectable rancher near San Miguel. But in 1891, his less savory brothers paid him a visit here in California on the ranch, not too far from the Estrella Adobe Church. Now, the Daltons like to do three things which I do not recommend doing simultaneously. They like to barbecue, they like to drink, and they like to shoot their revolvers, target practice. So I sometimes wonder if the hymns at the Adobe Church weren't interrupted by gunfire from the Dalton brothers. For some reason, which I do not understand, the respectable Bill Dalton decided to follow in his brother's footsteps. So he started robbing banks, and in the Indian Territory in 1893, this man, Marshal Shelton Lindsay, tracked him down. Bill was staying with a friend and was in the front yard playing with the friend's children when one of the children came in from the pasture leading a cow, past Shelton Lindsay and his deputy hiding in the grass, and warned Bill about their presence. He lit out. The two lawmen lit out after him with their Winchester rifles and brought him down. When they caught up to him, Bill Dalton looked up at them, smiled, and died. Now, little brother Emmett fared considerably better. This is Emmett Dalton. He was at Coffeyville. He was shot 23 times and survived to become a script consultant for Hollywood Westerns. You see, this photograph of him is autographed, and the recipient is Mr. Jess Lowry, who was the sheriff of San Luis Obispo County in the 1930s. Now, we had a stagecoach robber. We had a pair of train robbers with San Luis Obispo County connections, too. And what's eerie to me is how much their career parallels this one.
Well, that ought to do it. Think you use enough dynamite there, Butch?
And this actually happened to these two outlaws. They used a little bit too much dynamite on a Southern Pacific train near Pixley in the valley. On the left is John Sontag, who had been an employee of the Southern Pacific until one day he was partly impaled on a spike. Southern Pacific, being Southern Pacific, fired him. On the right, in old age, is his partner, Chris Evans, who had once mined for gold near Pozo during a brief gold rush there. Evans was married to a woman whose father had been involved in the Muscle Slough gunfight when farmers fought it out with gunmen deputized by the Southern Pacific that was condemning farmland along the railroad right-of-way. So anybody who robbed Southern Pacific trains was immensely popular. That's Francie Ledoux, the woman in the center. She's the founder of Halcyon, California's Temple of the People, a theosophical place of worship. Even the saintly Mrs. Ledoux referred to Southern Pacific as that beast. And of course, the Muscle Slough gunfight was turned into a novel by the muckraking writer Frank Norris. The novel was called The Octopus. Well, as always happens, the law finally caught up to Chris Evans and John Sontag. That's Sontag dying after a gunfight near Visalia. He had covered for Chris Evans. He said, I've had it, Chris. I'm not going to make it. You make a run for it, and I'll cover you, which he did. Chris Evans escaped, but he too had been wounded. He lost an eye and an arm. And he was found sleeping in a nearby farmhouse when he was arrested. He was later pardoned by a governor of California who hated the Southern Pacific too. To his dying day, Chris Evans denied that he had ever robbed railroads. At least it seemed to be that way. Until, of course, this happened. Now for a bold commercial announcement. A, thank you for having me. B, two of the books I've written contain substantial amounts of North County history, too. Of course, that's the Outlaws book on which this talk was based. And also a book called Central Coast Aviators in World War II. And two of those aviators flew P-38 fighters. Jack Langston, in the center, was tragically killed over Normandy in 1944. Bill Pope, who would later become the manager of the Paso Robles Inn, flew P-38s and then fell in love with one of my favorite airplanes, the P-51 Mustang, and he obviously survived the war. Both those books are available. I think I have 6 of each for $20. So again, thank you for having me tonight, and I hope I did a reasonably good job of pinch hitting for one of my other heroes in addition to Willie Mays is Dr. Dan Krieger.